emissions. We must build these new power stations to ensure security of supply while the low-carbon technology develops. And I fully believe that this country can be a global leader in CCUS. We have the right geology, the right infrastructure, and the right skills to be a world leader in carbon capture. That's why the government is making a massive £20 billion commitment to this game-changing technology, and why I'm focusing on how to create a competitive CCUS market by 2035. Second, these gas power plants will run less frequently as unabated as we build more and more low-carbon generation and long-term storage. But while we're bringing other flexible sources online, we won't take any risks. In the past 6 months, we've been accused of rolling back on our net zero plans. So let me tackle this head on. Britain is the poster child for net zero. We've halved our greenhouse gas emissions since 1990. Out of the top 20 largest economies in the world, nobody has done more than us. To give you an idea, the EU has cut emissions by only 30%, the US not at all, and China's emissions are up by 300%. And we've done that all whilst growing the economy and avoiding the riots and protests that we've seen abroad. And this last point is critical. There is no point in being world leading in cutting emissions if your businesses end up moving abroad and your people are suffering from high energy costs. Frankly, there's no point in being world leading at net zero if nobody wants to follow your lead. That's why we're putting investment first. Since 2010, we've seen £300 billion invested into green technology, creating jobs up and down the country. And in my past 6 months, I've delivered £30 billion of business investment into our energy revolution, thanks to the negotiations and policies that we've put in place. And this is key. Global investors are choosing to back Britain. Britain's story is one of endless innovation. We are perfectly placed to develop the technology and expertise to help developing nations with their own transitions. We have to be honest that this will be our biggest contribution to global climate change, more so than what happens with our own domestic emissions. Innovation, expertise, and exports. That's what the big energy economies like the US, Canada, Norway, and Saudi Arabia are doing. And I'll make sure that whether it's fusion energy, hydrogen, or carbon capture, we will both meet our net zero targets and that Britain will reap the reward for it. But we won't reap those rewards if we're not realistic about the time it will take to decarbonise our electricity grid. Our target to decarbonise the grid by 2035 has been set to allow time for a first-of-a-kind technology to evolve and for British supply chains to bloom. In stark contrast, Labour's plan for a decarbonised grid by 2030 in just 6 years' time is not a rational position. It's not something that businesses ask me for. It's not something that consumers ask me for. It would not leave time for British supply chains to develop, and it would signal to the rest of the world that we would have to pay whatever it takes to meet the cost of a target that is based on fantasy and which no other major economy is aiming for. What would be the risks? At worst, Labour's policy would plunge us into blackouts. At best, the costs of our energy system would skyrocket. We'd be left importing key components for our energy system from the current dominant global players. So let me be clear, whether that's minerals or batteries or cables, Keir Starmer's policy is for a made-in-China energy transition, but I want one that is made in Britain, that's made in Teesside, in Cornwall, and Aberdeen, and everywhere in between. And that's why just last week, the Chancellor announced that Giga just got bigger. Our Green Industry Growth Accelerator now totals over £1 billion and will grow the supply chains for all the clean technologies that we need for the future. We're doing everything that we can to help our future technologies develop with multi-billion pound programmes and capital allowances for clean investments in carbon capture, hydrogen, fusion energy and offshore wind. However, anybody sensible will tell you that these things take time. To pretend that you can do things overnight is a fundamentally dishonest position. To pretend that policies that you once said would require £28 billion of borrowing can now happen at the same pace but without the price tag is a fundamentally dishonest position. But the British people are not stupid. This debate is too important for the future of our country for politicians to be dishonest with the public about the choices that we have to make. People should not have policies imposed on them which are not in their interests, and that will never be this government's approach. Everything that we do in energy must work to keep the cost of energy down whilst keeping the lights on. Yes, that means not taking chances with our energy system by ensuring it has everything it needs to remain resilient. And it means allowing the market to bring forward those next generation technologies that will strengthen our energy system and turn a profit for Britain so we can grow our economy. But it also means making sure our energy market prioritises the bill payer. Bills are most people's only experience of the energy system. It's through cost that people will judge our success, and that's why we're leaving no stone unturned to cut bills. This is what we must remember as we today launch the next step of our review of electricity market arrangements, or REMA. This is the biggest electricity market reform in a generation. It will mean cheaper bills, massive investment, energy security for decades, and cleaner energy as well. In this next round of consultation, we've kept zonal pricing on the table to explore it more thoroughly. This is a potential supply-side reform which would encourage companies to build infrastructure closer to where energy is needed. It would mean our energy system would be smaller and more efficient, and less energy infrastructure would be needed overall, leading to lower costs for consumers. We've already seen it successfully used in other renewable energy powerhouses like Norway and Denmark. Alongside other options that we are considering, it could mean £35 billion in savings over 20 years. That's a saving of up to £45 every year for each household. But let's be clear, every household, whether they are in Glasgow, Grimsby or Guildford, would benefit from market reform. This ambition, cutting bills for everyone, is exactly why we're keeping zonal pricing on the table. And that's why we're working hard to grasp the opportunities of renewables for consumers. With a smarter energy system, we can shave up to 11% off peak demand. It sounds technical, but that's a £50 billion opportunity for bill payers over the next 25 years. An electric car driver on the right tariff could charge overnight when electricity is cheapest, meaning that while they used to pay 70p per mile using petrol, they now pay 2p per mile. The same would apply to household energy bills. Our work on smart energy tariffs based on the cheapest price of energy in the day could save households up to £900 a year. There is huge potential here for us to cut the cost of living. We should give families the choice to use cheaper energy when it suits them. We'll use our conservative principles of competition, choice and efficiency to give families the best chance of cheaper energy. And this will cut costs for businesses too. So as we contemplate the challenges ahead, our strategy will follow common sense principles, principles that reflect the reality that energy security is not just about having plentiful supplies, but affordable energy too. That Britain, with our history of energy expertise, is well placed to reap the rewards of creating the new energy technologies of the future if we manage that transition well. A hard-headed and realistic approach about our future energy system, prioritising the national interest over narrow ideology, and taking the necessary steps to cut costs for families and businesses. That's the approach I've outlined to you today, and that's the way Britain will continue to lead the world towards a cleaner, cheaper and more secure future. Thank you.
So thank you. Time for a few questions. I said before, we agreed before, and I'd do it in 2 rounds, one from the press and then open it up to everyone else, and I hope that we can get through those in 7 minutes. So maybe Tom Clark from Sky and Jonathan Leakey from The Telegraph. That's okay.
Thank you very much. I think speaking to people in the energy sector, their biggest complaint about getting us to a low carbon energy system is the constant playing of politics around energy. and that's the biggest obstacle to getting there. What would you say to that in a day we've heard headlines about blackouts and not gambling with our energy future?
Well, this is the entire point that I'm trying to make. We need to be able to have honest debates about what kind of energy system we need and what that requires, which is why we've set out this position on gas, which is why we are, I think, the only party to talk about the importance of oil and gas in our system overall, and how much the people who invest in oil and gas are also investing in the new technologies of the future. So I would say our position is based on evidence, it's based on fact. It comes from the fact that I talk to hundreds of people from industry and investors. I do think there is an important point here, which I'm trying to make, which is that the 2030 decarbonisation of the grid policy, that is pure politics. That does not come from fact. It does not come from industry. It does not come from consumers. And that is not the way that we can create policy when it comes to our energy.
Thank you. Who's that? Oh, sorry. Looking around. Go. Here.
Hi there. Yeah, Jonathan Leake. I'm the energy editor at the Telegraph. Just quickly, so you talk about an end to unabated gas, and I can follow all the arguments, but roughly when might we see an end to unabated gas? I know you can't be exact, but approximately when? And then just on zonal pricing, as I understand it, you're going to seek to attract generators to build, say, solar farms or wind farms near to cities and towns, and they'll be able to charge more for the power they generate. You talked about there being a saving of £45 a year, which I think relates to getting rid of constraint payments or reducing them. But if those generators are charging more for the power they generate around cities and towns, surely that's going to add to bills. So I wonder whether you can just explain whether there will not be, as well as a reduction of £45 per year, an increase because of the extra costs of generating around in those areas, and what the net balance you think might eventually be. Will there really be a saving for consumers, and can you predict that far ahead anyway?
So firstly, in terms of savings for consumers, we're consulting on zonal pricing, but the whole point of it is that you need less energy infrastructure overall. So you've got a smaller and more efficient grid, which is why you get savings. And we've published analysis alongside our announcement today, which shows that every part of the country should get some savings. But, you know, as you rightly say, there's questions to explore, which is why we're consulting on that policy. But I personally think that when you're presented with a policy that can lower bills for families around the country, we have a moral duty to explore that thoroughly. And on your first question, remind me because you did two, very naughty. Right. So on that, what you need is a flexible capacity, so then when the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow, you've got something underneath that can ramp up when you've got demand. Now, at the moment, there's different forms of long duration storage that we're exploring. So you could have abated gas through CCUS, you could have hydrogen. We are consulting on other types of long duration storage as well. But a lot of the stuff is first of a kind technology, right? So you don't know exactly when you will definitely have enough, which is why we want to have unabated gas and the amount of new unabated gas online, so we've got that as an insurance policy. In terms of those other forms, you can see how much we're backing these new technologies. I did a hydrogen investor forum last week where 350 people came, and actually I don't think anyone in the world is doing more than us when it comes to hydrogen. In carbon capture, another form of how you might proceed with abatement, we set out £20 billion to make sure that we can move this technology forward. And I would say this is something which is really important for us in terms of our competitive advantages. So we are quite literally throwing the kitchen sink at making sure we've got these different types of flexible capacity. But until that time that's online, we need to have gas as a backup.
I'll take two questions. Two people caught my eye. There was a lady there in the red and white jacket, and there's a gentleman there at the back. And then if we could do both of those, and then we'll try and do another, come back to the journalists as well.
Thank you very much.
Please keep them very short.
Sure. I'm Sheila. I'm from Botswana, but I'm also a senior associate fellow here at Chatham House. I ask my question as a citizen of Africa. I'm mindful that the British government is contemplating partnerships in the critical raw material space. And my question, therefore, is one, what is your distinct value proposition to African governments wanting to do business with you in the mineral space, and how does that value proposition differ from that which the British government has offered those countries in the last century?
Thank you. And then the gentleman there, if you just raise your hand. Yeah, great, yeah.
Claire, just to pick up on
Please
Tom's
introduce
point.
yourself, sorry.
Sorry, my name's Josh Dugdale from the Urge Collective. Just to pick up on Tom's point about playing party politics, the previous panel was concerned in quite a big way as to the message being sent to consumers and investors. And consistency is so important. And I just wonder, in your quest to become a model for other countries, whether you couldn't sit down with your shadow counterparts and come up with a strategy together, because it's such an important issue, which would send a really positive message to investors and consumers with a view to being able to put their money and their choices in the right places going forward, as opposed to what's happened over the last years of people really not knowing what the government strategy is, or the policy is, or what the messaging is.
Okay, so on that, I would say there's very few countries who've set out as much detail as we have when it comes to the transition to net zero. Very, very few. We've set out in much, much greater detail than almost every single one of our counterparts, which is why we are the first country in the G20 to halve emissions, and we've got the most ambitious targets going forward. So I would say actually we've got a lot of clarity compared to other people. In terms of politics, I would argue that actually one of the most important things in making sure that people around the world can see what's happening in the transition and want to do their own is that we can do this in a way which is fair to households and businesses. And we've seen in continental Europe, if you get that wrong, the riots and the protests that have happened there, I don't think are a great advert for success. Whereas here, we've grown the economy, we've still got broad consensus, but we do need to make sure, as we're talking about these decisions, A, we're being honest about the choices that we face, and B, that we are putting consumers and the needs of businesses in this country first. Because if we don't make our transition to net zero look good and a positive experience, then other people will not want to do it, and that's not the ball game. In terms of your conversation, critical minerals, so important. So we've got a critical minerals strategy. It's something that we talk about with our international counterparts. As you'll know, there's quite a lot of different partnerships and forums at the moment. The policy that we've set out on the strategy is making sure that we have good ESG standards, and that we're doing that in partnership with countries to make sure that actually the mining that needs to take place works for them. So I would urge you to have a look at that. I do think it's one of the really key things that we need to make sure that we have access to in the coming decades.
Have we got time for one more? Claire's team.
Do you want to do a very quick one? I'll do shorter answers.
Okay.
Apologies.
Please, gentleman here. And then two. And then, yeah, please do really keep them brief as possible.
I will do, I promise. Nick Johnson, BBC. Thank you, Secretary of State. The presumption was that you'd always close gas plants when they come to the end of their lives. So what's new in today's announcement? And also, the Prime Minister has spoken recently about MP safety. So why does your party and your government continue to support and defend Frank Hester following his comments about Diane Abbott? Thank you.
Minister, Paul McNamara, Channel 4 News. With regards to the new gas power stations, these are pretty dire warnings which you're responding to. But this is 14 years into being into power, having failed to deliver nuclear power plants. You've got a track record of U-turning on large-scale infrastructure like HS2, and a track record of shifting the goalposts on green policies like the banning of diesel cars. What faith can anyone in this room or voters at home have that you will actually deliver these power plants in a time fashion that, well, keeps the lights on?
Okay, so let me take that head on. We are the country that's added the most renewable capacity to our grid by one other country in Europe. So, if you look at all of the stuff that we've built since we've been in power, it means that now almost half of our electricity comes from renewable energy. What we inherited from the previous Labour government was only 7% of our electricity coming from energy. I would say that that is actually a revolution and something that not many other countries have achieved. So that, I think, is a good example. In terms of nuclear, We are building nuclear. Again, we were not left a great legacy, and what you don't want in nuclear is a stop-start strategy, which is why the expansion plans that I set out cover multiple decades and set out a really long forward look so that people have the confidence to invest and to also make sure that we're building skills here. And just to come back to gas, that is the point that we're making today. We want to give investors confidence. This is something that we know that we need. Like I said, virtually no one in the world is doing more than us when it comes to building renewables. But we know that underneath that, you need something when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. And what we want to do is make sure that investors have confidence to build what we need in this country. Thank you very much.
Great.
I think I'm going to have to go.
You have to go now. Well, I'd just like, thank you very much indeed. If people could stay put in their seats while the Secretary of State leaves, that would be great.
Thank you very much. Thank you.